Then I'll call the meeting to order at 6:08. And before we get started, I want to let everyone know that we're going to need an executive session starting at 8 o'clock tonight. So you'll have a hard stop to have a conversation with the Lincoln board members around the exit agreement. So that will be labeled as 1 VSA 313A 1A. And that particular item needs a motion to find that premature general knowledge would put the body at a substantial disadvantage, and then a motion to go into executive session and invite the Lincoln School District Board, Patrick and Floyd, to join the board. Okay.
So we'll do that right beforehand, before going in.
Yes. Yep. So about 7:55, I guess, if you can allow for those two motions to happen. And Krista, I sent you the wording for help. Yeah. And I'm not feeling well. So Krista's going to run the remainder of the meeting. I may remain logged in, but I'm not, it's going to be too hard to facilitate the meeting remotely with you all in person. So I'm going to let Krista run it. And I'll be here for a little bit, but no promises. There's quite a lightning storm over Moncton, and like I said, I'm not feeling well. So Krista, if you would care to take over from this point, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I think at this point we are at public comments. Is there anybody online? There's nobody else here as a visitor, but if there's anybody online who'd like to make a comment. Okay, it doesn't look like there is anybody at this time. So we'll move to the consent agenda. So if I could have a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved, Chris.
Chris. And a second. Bailey. Okay, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any, what's the word I'm looking for?
Opposed.
Not opposed, thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries.
Actually, Krista, I should abstain because I didn't make the last meeting, so.
Okay, thanks, Brad. All right, so we have Brad abstaining. Okay, so moving on to executive limitations monitoring, A1 and A2, 2.8 communication and support to the board. So Patrick, can I just hand it over to you at this point?
Sure. So as you may recall, we've been having sort of ongoing conversations around the ends, and something that's been sort of missing from the board's perspective from the ends monitoring report in years past, and haven't really been able to put our finger on what that is. So this is an attempt to check the pulse of that and see, is this what's been missing? And if so, how might we move that forward? So the idea here is that perhaps something like a quarterly presentation to the board about some of the work that's happening related to the ends. There may be a data component to it, but it's not sort of exclusively data. It would be a little bit more of the means that are underway as they relate to working toward the ends. So it could be in the shape of sort of organized around the strategic plan. It could be in the form of looking at it sort of by discrete subject areas. It could be, we could even focus on MTSS. So there's a lot of different directions it could go, but it's sort of, the idea is maybe what's missing from the board perspective is peeling back some of the layers of the work that's involved, which provides you some of the context for our efforts in pursuit of achieving the ends. And so I offer that as an option for moving forward, if that seems like what's been missing all along. As Krista and I have debriefed Krista and actually Liz were members of the Strategic Plan Oversight Committee, and they got essentially this level of information, peeling back lots of layers about the work involved around the strategic plan, and that really satisfied some interests and curiosities and provided context for them. But only the two of them as board members got that because of their membership on that committee. And we thought maybe that's the missing piece here. So sort of started it from that perspective, just offering that as something. and love to hear your thoughts on if that is a value add. Is that really hitting on what's been missing? Is it something different? Just in our pursuit of trying to drill down a little bit. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Krista, from our conversations, or Dawn.
Well, I know for me, I appreciate having context to all the work that's going on in the district, so that when things arise, even if they're not necessarily related to whatever it is that comes up and brought to the board, I have an idea of how the machine is moving forward. And it really helps me to contextualize all the work that's happening in the district, and understand and appreciate how the strategic plan is moving forward in a way that the ends report often feels like it's just like scratching the surface, and it's not getting at that for me. And like Patrick mentioned, when Liz and I were on the oversight team, we heard a great presentation from Gabe Hamilton and Ray Donovan that provided some of that deeper look at the expertise in learning and social and emotional work that was happening, that it just was so helpful to hear, to know that these things are happening in our schools in all these different ways. It was really good insight for me. So, yeah.
So 2 thoughts I had. One is that we're obviously in the last several rounds of this policy reporting non-compliance for obvious reasons, but knowing more about the plan to become compliant is, I think, part of our work. So understanding at that point, I think it's appropriate to dive a little bit into the means. Otherwise, it's difficult to understand what the path is to compliance. 2, it might also help in these presentations to give us a feel for what is a reasonable goal. I think folks have talked about how do we set maybe some short-term goals, some definable, measurable goals that aren't quite so lofty as the full ends aspiration. And that might be a good part of one of these sessions, is just to say, here's what we're seeing as kind of yardsticks that we can talk about ways to provide evidence towards improvement. And then one thing you said, Krista, that kicked off in my head was maybe getting some feedback from maybe some outside sources during some of these meetings about what they're seeing going on in the region for people meeting ends, and what are we doing that compares to that. That might be a good segue in some of those meetings to get an outside viewpoint.
At the regional VSBA meeting, there was a presentation. I'm not sure how to say this right, but there was a presentation that had a lot to do with formulating and understanding the relationship and how the progress of moving your school or district forward. And there's a committee, the VSBA has a committee formed at the request of either the Agency of Education or the legislature through the Agency of Education, which they kind of reported out their work, which reminded me a lot of our struggles with how we define the ends in such a way that they can be measurable. And I can't remember the 3 bullets, but they basically had 3 different bullets of different things that need to be considered from a board perspective as to, you know, the process and the procedures and how to govern yourselves, as well as just make sure that you're getting out of the organization what, you know, you're trying to get out of the organization. That is being reviewed by all the regional districts, I guess you could say, and then there will be feedback based on those comments back to I think it's AOE. And one of the things that, and I yip about it a lot, is one of the things is to, you know, have step goals and that sort of thing. And if we start looking at this quarterly, maybe it'll be easier to come up with that strategy. Another comment that was brought up in the conversation, it wasn't necessarily in the forefront of the committee that was formulating this and developing it, was the relationship with the superintendent and the board to come up with these values and these goals, short-term, long-term, what have you, and then the importance of a non-professional board, I guess you could call it, and then the profession of the administration, and making sure there's just a balance between those two things, where, you know, a board can't necessarily go out with it in a vacuum and develop this. And a lot of the expertise internally is through the administration. So that was recognized as a good comment to maybe develop that, or be more overt about that relationship with the whole process. But and this is something I went, you know, it was discussed cold. So I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of time to think about it, but it looked like there was a lot of good points within that committee had developed to, you know, improve the effort of every board governing itself, as well as developing a long range plan.
Yeah, it's a governance standards that the legislature, I think, is trying to not just having schools follow the education quality standards, but having boards follow a governance standard. And the legislature directed, I think, AOE to come up with these standards, and they have asked the VSBA to spirit a task force to go through those. So at this regional meeting, they passed out a draft of the governance standards. Maybe I'll send that around to everybody after the meeting here. And was there did she send a follow-up also of the notes that came out of that meeting?
I haven't seen them if she has.
There were a lot of comments. People made a lot of comments. There were some little breakout groups, and we came back together, and a lot of them had to do with, you know, how do you monitor superintendent performance? How do you monitor what we would call ends? Not everybody calls them ends. And then how do you know that your school board is assisting with that process and not hindering it? Mm-hmm. You know, which is, I think, one of the main goals of the legislative action, is to make sure that the boards are well run, because it's pretty, they were saying at the beginning of the meeting, it's pretty clear from a lot of national study work that poor governance is can be directly related to poor student performance. Get a lot of board turnover, a lot of superintendent turnover, and pretty soon your strategic plans are no longer strategic, and the kids can see how that affects them, and the performance is related to that. So I think this is what we're talking about right now is a good step towards that.
Sarah?
I know I'm just glancing at last year's. I dug it out, and I know it's not your typical version, but when you're talking about the quarterly, is it something where you can do, because a lot of the data that is from math or ELA, or it's from, and you know, there's kind of math scattered throughout, like, would you do something on like, here's where we are in that kind of broad subject as one of them, and then do an ELA one, and maybe do an emotional, social emotional, or and then like transitions. I'm like in and out of or through vertically. I'm just curious what, because I think it would help understand all of the I think it would be helpful. And I like the idea, and you can just see, here's where even if you can't see it in this little number, here's where we're seeing this progress in, you know, like when we just get a whole lot of data, like in the MAP or whatever it is, like this is, we can see, you know, we felt like this, and now here where we are, you know, post, you know, disaster, and where like here, look at how, even though we're not quite back to where we are, if we just follow this one group of kids, we have a good sense of like what types of things are working well here and what types of things we're going to try. So that, to me, I get that it's means, but I think it would help give a backstory to the numbers that I think we look at.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I think there's a role for sharing data that may be similar but different from what you see in the ends. In particular, so we wouldn't be showing really SPEC data because that's only given annually. So we have other assessments that we give 2 or 3 times a year that we may want to time these presentations following an assessment window where we have some fresh data, and we meet a couple of times a year looking at, we do these data dives where we look at that data kind of individualized by school, looking at what are some areas of growth that are needed in that data, and plans are developed to help address that. So we can kind of tie it to that, but I think there's a role for data, but the emphasis wouldn't be on data for these, that the interest seems to be, what's the work that's happening? That I like the way you put it, Steve. We're not reporting compliance on the ends, and so we have a plan on how to become compliant, which has lots of means tied to it. What are some of those things that we're doing to address the areas that we're not performing as well as we want to? And what's some of the end of the data points along the way that are helping us suggest whether or not that's having the effect we want?
Yeah.
And we may be able to show broad, at some points, we might be able to show some pockets of success. We'll have to be kind of careful because it can become identifiable, and we have to avoid that. But it's, yeah, there's sort of checkpoints along the way to say, we weren't compliant, here's some of the work that's happening, here's a little bit of the data we're seeing in our efforts to improve student outcomes. And again, how that's structured, I think there's a lot left to be ironed out, but I think that's the idea.
And I think I would add that something else you mentioned, Steve, was sort of the goals and setting of the goals and yardsticks. And I think that's your job, is to set those. The strategic plan has done that, right? But I think that's your work, is with your team to set those goals and yardsticks. And I think what maybe has happened with the annual report is we're kind of missing like the in-between from where we started and the report, like what's happening around those goals, how were they impacted by COVID, or what work's being done to develop assessments. Like I know Katrina's brought that to us a lot, that those are in progress. But this is a great opportunity for us to really hear a little more about that. So we know when the end report comes, we're not in compliance, but we understand a little more about some parts of the work that are hopefully getting us there. And I think what I appreciated with the way this is designated as communication and support to the board is that it's different than determining whether the ends are the right ends. Like that's where our ownership linkage comes in, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is more our team telling us how we're doing getting toward those ends that we've identified together as a community. And so far, I think we've said it in a couple of different ways. And, you know, we now have superintendent check-ins, but in a number of different ways we've said, I think we need more communication. And I think this could be a really great way. And to me, it seems like it's for you to say what you think is most important for us to know. You know, and maybe we say, yeah, that's great, we want more or less, but it seems like it's, you know, it would be great for you to determine what you think is really helpful for us to hear about and why.
Mhm.
Well, I assume you're also going to end up with still a final ends report at the end of the year.
Mhm.
And instead of us sort of getting that kind of cold over the span of a whole year and then having to react to it,
Mhm.
you know, it'll be a little bit more incremental, will be a little more up to speed.
Yeah.
There'll be maybe a little less confused about progress. So I think it's a good idea.
You'll be better able to participate in either the commiserating or the celebrating, depending on the results at the end, right? Like when we're talking all along the way of the hard work that's happening and how great we feel about it and some of those checkpoints along the way, which is typically the case, right? We feel really good about the work happening, and then these assessments happen and the results aren't quite where they want them to be. You know? But at some point, one of these years, and really it's going to be these incremental improvements, we're going to get to celebrate together as well. And that's where maybe sometimes looking at those pockets of success can be helpful, and talking about ways we're trying to replicate that and expand that across the organization. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential. I think just getting started is the hardest part, and then we can evolve as we go, and we get feedback from you as a board if it's like, where's it hitting the mark, where's it missing the mark, and we can make adjustments along the way. But getting something started to bring that level of information to you seems important.
Is there anybody online who hasn't said anything that wants to chime in on this or has anything else to offer? Great. So it sounds like we're rolling forward.
Okay.
You have our blessing.
So we'll try to map out when these 3 or 4 opportunities to bring this information to you over the course of the year make sense, and we'll work that into the work plan.
Does it need a motion because it has one next to the thing?
It's not an action item,
Okay.
so that's just the form for the agenda, but
Just checking.
thanks. Yeah. Okay, so next is board management and governance, A3 and A4. And so the first topic is developing an ownership linkage plan. And so this is where it's our job to really think about those ends, that ends language, and is it still on par with what our community values? And I can't remember exactly when the ends policy was adopted. 2018 is sort of ringing a bell. But we haven't reached back out. A lot of work was done to develop the strategic plan and have that be really inclusive of the voices of stakeholders and our owners. So our owners, just so everyone's on the same page, are the taxpayers of MAUSD. So we have stakeholders, and that includes people who may or may not be taxpayers. So for example, if you're a teacher who works in the district, you're a stakeholder, but you're not paying taxes, so you're not considered an owner. It's the language of policy governance, but I think the idea is that we need that those folks have a financial stake and an interest in ensuring that what we're doing is the right thing according to their tax dollars and to the goals we set out for our students. So we haven't really dipped back into that ends policy language with our community, although I will say that I think when we worked with Sue McCormick and we developed the list of education values with her, that we didn't call it ends work, but I think those educational values are really connected to our ends. But since the time that the ends were developed, we haven't set a plan, and we're not in compliance because we haven't set that plan, as we talked about at our last meeting, to more mindfully, deliberatively connect with our owners. And the ends haven't changed much, except that, and maybe there were other places, but the one that I'm most thinking about is adding language about equity into our ends policy. And so that was based on a recommendation from the VSBA to adopt a district-wide equity policy. And we instead added language about equity into our ends. So that's one piece that's changed. And the other part of our, so it's our job really to think about the ends policy and all of our policies to make sure they're really clear and robust and also informed by input from our owners. And then we hand them off to our district leaders to say, okay, you guys figure out how you're going to do that and then tell us how it's going. So, so I think to really identify what an ownership linkage plan would look like, it would help to answer two questions. One, keeping that future focus, big picture idea in mind, what do we want to ask our owners about? And also, secondly, in what ways can we connect with those folks? And there are lots of different ways to connect with people. We've done some of them in the past. But first, I think we need to figure out, what we're looking for is input on this sort of long-term big picture vision for the district, not the day-to-day operations. So we really need to make sure we understand what our owners value and what their priorities are, because we all have a lot of things we value, but we can't necessarily achieve them all at the same time. So one example of a question we could ask our owners gets back at that issue of equity, which is something that has been changed in our ends policy. We could ask, for example, what does it mean to be an equitable school district? Or we could say in 5 to 10 years, what would that look like? So that's a really big question. It could be really cool to ask a whole different, cast of groups of owners, what that means to them. And then we could look at all of our policies to see how is that articulated in our policies. And then we're giving a pretty clear direction to our administration on that, what that value looks like for our owners. We could also look at policies we've reviewed recently. There have been a couple that we noted had maybe some language that was missing or not robust enough. We could ask about those things. One was the language around adding accessibility to our asset protection policy. We might decide that would be a really, that we want to get input from our owners around what does accessibility look like, so that we're not just coming up with language changes ourselves, but it's informed by the law, by stakeholders, by owners, by lots of input. So I think that first question, what do we want to ask people about is where we can start. And I wonder if it would be helpful to just spend a few minutes brainstorming any other questions. I mentioned equity, and I mentioned policies that we've already identified needing more language change. Are there other big picture questions that we can think of that we might want to go out to our owners and ask about? Maybe start there and see if there's anything to add to that list.
So the screen, I don't.
Oops, we lost her. Okay. Hopefully you guys caught what we're going to do next. So we're going to do some brainstorming around questions we want to ask our owners. Do people want to just pair up and talk a little bit and then share back as a group? I know it's hard with people online, or we could just talk as a group. What do folks think? As a group, I think. As a group?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do folks think?
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that it may be that we want to have meetings with the owners to find out what their questions are. Maybe that, we might be trying to think about questions they might want answered, but they might be easier to have them tell us. And maybe, maybe if there's a Q&A with the board kind of thing where people could come in and ask questions, and maybe we'd have the answers, maybe we wouldn't, but we could have a discussion about them and find out what's on people's minds, what's a priority for folks, and work it the other way, maybe in conjunction with what you're talking about. I was thinking sort of like, you know, if we're gonna have a night where the PTO comes in, or we have a night where we talk to the local select boards, or whatever we're doing, you know, that it might be a back and forth, like we might have some questions for them, and they might have questions for us.
Yeah.
In the ends policy, it says, so that they can meet the challenges of lifelong learners and responsible citizens. And I think I would like to know more about what people are assuming would be in 5 to 10 years, like the challenges, and what that, kind of defining that a little bit more.
Yeah, what does it mean to be a lifelong learner?
Right.
And what is a responsible citizen? Maybe that's recorded somewhere, but.
And that could be shifting and changing a little, right?
What do you mean, Sarah? You said maybe it's recorded somewhere, as in like we've asked them
Well,
before?
well, I don't know that, I think that our administrators and probably instructors, and maybe even a lot of students understand what the school means by, or the district means by lifelong learners or responsible citizens, but it might not be the same as what the owners or everybody knows is. So I think hearing what that perspective is would be maybe another question. So so that they can meet the challenges of lifelong learners. It's actually kind of confusing anyway.
So like, what are the challenges?
Yeah, what's the challenge of being a lifelong learner? Is that really the right phrase? I don't know. So we might want to change our language if our.
I mean, I think it could be that we would decide this policy language maybe isn't
Where we are.
quite right now. You know, I think I said 2018 that it was adopted. I don't know. That's right.
Well, it was done
Way earlier than
That's the
2018.
interpretation, the policy itself would have been many.
Way earlier.
Well, one thing, if you're.
So yeah,
looking at-
so it hasn't.
What
so it's
is a
been while.
responsible citizen and what is the cost that is acceptable to the community? If we're gonna have those phrases in there, I mean, I think you gotta pay for it, so you need to, that's something to ask.
Question of purpose is coming to mind for me, like
Yeah.
without the purpose to know how you approach the questions and whether they're driven by the board or received by the community is unclear. It just would, I think it would materialize differently if the purpose is to ask questions to gather information to change the policy, or if the purpose is to ask questions to further clarify the policy. And we've sort of talked a little bit about both already in this conversation, and maybe one drives the other, but.
Well, and is this requirement to develop this ownership linkage plan? Can we back up to where that requirement comes from?
Yeah.
Are you looking for clarification on that?
Yeah, because what I think Patrick is talking about is that there's something from the ends policy that
Yep.
drives the
Correct.
requirement for the linkage plan.
Right. And
So
so,
let's go over that for a second.
yeah, so I don't know who else has this. We all got these a couple of years ago, but there's four workbooks on policy governance, and there's one specifically on ownership linkage. And a lot of the information on ownership linkage refers to developing the ends. Less information about regularly
Monitoring.
monitoring is different, right?
Right.
But connecting with owners about the ends. And so it seems to me like it was done a long time ago, but it's a pretty big, involved, intensive process. So you wouldn't necessarily do that all over again they're meant to be, I think, broad and all encompassing to have some long shelf life. Right. But I think what is important is to maybe figure out, as we're, this is something Kevin talks about a lot, is that we're supposed to be really sort of future planning. Where are we headed? What's what do we want to look like in 5 to 10 years? And so I think it's our job to think about our ends and how pertinent they or what they look like in the future according to our community. And so being a responsible citizen, you know, could be a really good question. You know, what does an equitable school district look like? Could be a really good question. I think it's to better help us understand whether the policies that we have are going to match what our community is saying that they want to see out of our district in 5 to 10 years.
It also might help provide some of the data that we might, or give more ideas about what that data would look like to be able to provide.
Yeah.
This.
Right, because it seems like one of the questions would be, what, you know, how do you know if
And
you're
how
a
to
lifelong learner? What does that look like?
Yeah,
And how do you
right?
communicate
And
that
so then if,
to the owners,
Yeah.
communicate it back?
what are they, and again, asking them a little bit about what would they expect to see for evidence?
I go back to the word challenges too, because I'm wondering, let's say this was created in 2015. The challenges of 2015 are drastically different than the challenges 5 years from now. And you know, my kids, I want to make sure my kids are prepared for those challenges and in that world. So just, I feel like that, even just knowing the challenges that are coming up in 5 or 10 years are kind of critical to say, oh, we better make sure our kids can do X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's a computer thing, maybe it's communication or whatever.
working with diverse folks.
Yeah.
A lot of different things.
Brad's hand is up.
Oh, Brad, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm not exactly sure how this fits in, but sometimes, you know, I think that, you know, the community, you know, broadly speaking, thinks of the school system, the school board as sort of separate and apart, you know, from the broader community. So kind of picking up on one of the comments that Steve just made is having maybe a more robust ability to sort of to communicate and, you know, connect with you know, like the select boards and the business community and, you know, business leaders, you know, in our community might be a very useful way to you know, shape the ends policy and not further the perception among a lot of people that we're kind of just heading off in our own direction and you know, separate and apart from the broader need, you know, say economic and social needs of the community.
Yeah, and I think there's so many great examples, and some of them are things we did, you know, back when we worked with Stu McCormick, that I think folks, they were big picture questions about what we value in for, you know, in our education system, but engaging with lots of different people, I think that was really powerful for folks. So
Well, it might be good.
that's kind of the how.
It might be good to, I think it was condensed into a sort of a more manageable format, the result of that exploration.
Yep.
And that might be a great jump starter for one of these meetings to sort of pass that out and say, you know, this is what we sort of found the last time we did this kind of investigation. What are you guys thinking about it today?
Yeah, some of those might still be relevant and some have shifted.
It certainly validates all that work that was done to develop those.
Well, that, and you know, we've been through a lot since then, just, you know, with all the stuff going on, and it's always good to sort of refresh people's opinions of things.
Just found your flyer.
Yeah, let's talk. Right, and that was in 2018, which it feels like it was just yesterday, but it was a while ago. Other ideas or thoughts people have on?
So
You got a furrowed brow, Kevin. What's up? What's behind the curtain?
no, I mean, my thoughts are going all over the place. I think I'm not, and maybe it's a good exercise and it's a needed exercise, but I think there's a certain constituency that has a whole different concept of what they perceive as successful than what we necessarily do. And I'm not sure how much of that's informed or uninformed, but nonetheless, it's there. I found, well, it seems like when we distilled through the Sue McCormick process to have, well, the 7 or 8 key values, the merger study committee went through a process a lot quicker. So there wasn't as much depth, but it did involve public participation. And it was interesting, some of the parallels that came out of that as well. So I'm not sure so I guess I'm kind of going back and forth when we start talking about community wants and desires. I'm not sure that they're going to be purely academic. Or equitable, or some of the things that we really focus on over time. And I'm not, and I think it's a double-edged sword, and I've said this 100 times, is it would be important to have some level of facilitation for that, because I think as we go out and seek opinions, select boards are great, PTOs are great. There are people, and maybe it becomes a educational thing as much as a linkage thing to get input, is there are people out there that, and until it becomes a hot button for them, they just go on with life. And it would be unfortunate to not somehow tap that. And I don't even know. I'm coming to the conclusion you can't tap that. but I'd always keep saying in the back of my mind, there's these people that are going through and have opinions and value their students as they're growing up as kids and whatnot. And sometimes I'm not sure that we get the whole picture when we go out for comments.
I agree. I also think we keep trying to do like big things, and maybe it's just like our technique, what's the website or the platform or Thought Exchange. Thank you. So Thought Exchange, you try like one of those, one of these questions, and you toss one out every month, and you just see who bites and responds and writes in stuff, and it just gets sent home and sent to Front Porch Forum. And we're not on such a massive quest to like do it all and not, and it's like we are getting the people that are thinking about it, we're at least getting their thoughts on a variety of different little topics. And it might be, I might see one and I'd be like, I just don't honestly care. And then there might be something else where I do. So I think when it's just one question, we could have a future question. You could have I'm just reading random other websites ideas like, here's a list of our outcomes that we offer. Which of these is the most important, or which of these is the least important, or in the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think will be the most significant challenge facing our either graduates or students when they're in school? Just like even along those lines, and see what types of stuff comes back. And then we're not trying to like analyze some giant mash of data. Like we're just getting like much smaller chunks, and it's more regular. And I think that helps us keep the conversation and us keep either, I don't want to say evolving, not necessarily the language, but like our conversation anyway. I think the big event is really hard to pull off and super exhausting. And I think we need to, right now, not be doing that. I think
we have
too many things.
Other things that we're getting feedback for.
Yeah.
soon. I mean, I think your point is well taken, and we're getting into the kind of the how
Right,
part. And there's a lot of ways to do it.
right.
One of the important things to keep in mind is, you know, it is valuable to have a variety of ways to connect with folks. And I think quality is
Yeah,
better than quantities.
And you
Right.
don't want to burn people out.
You don't want to burn people out. But
No.
there are also people who might enjoy a low-key conversation in a targeted.
oh, I think you do a variety of things,
Yeah.
but just in the general, like,
Yes.
Yeah, I think a monthly town hall is definitely not.
no, not, yeah.
But however, a lot of our schools have PTOs that meet, and it wouldn't like,
Right,
I already go to mountains.
And this is
Being
a
able to-
3-year plan,
Mhm.
right,
Yeah.
that we're supposed to be developing, not do it in the next 6 months.
oh, great.
I wonder if maybe what you're saying, Sarah, makes me think like maybe we stay in the brainstorming of questions and mode for a little bit longer till we get past the merger vote.
I think that's a good idea.
Liz has her hand up.
Might be tackled.
Because that is going to be a ton of linkage.
Yeah.
Liz?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. And also I would, for me is, I think it would be neat for our community to brainstorm together what equity and access for all of our students looks like what are the, and then kind of breaking it down into areas. What does that look like service wise? What does that look like capital wise or environmentally, and kind of hashing out a little bit what it means when we say that, and what the community expectations are for that, so that we can kind of think about, that could help us think about the decisions that we make when we go to spend money on improving parts of the buildings to make them more accessible, or with that could be, this is something that our community talked about is important under the equity lens, right? So maybe that's kind of something we could think about and brainstorm together.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liz. And I think that, we have this, I'm saying pending, but that sounds very, we have a vote coming up. And that is like taking up a lot of space. At the same time, there are things out in the universe that are happening that I think are coming, that do come back down to us, that will come in from the community that we maybe need to flesh out more. And I think equity is one of them. And we've heard it a lot in a lot of different ways, even when we were talking about school consolidation, there were a lot of folks talking about, well, what does equity mean? Or I think it means this, and I think it means that. There's a lot of, conversation around gender equity and anti-racism and so much stuff that I wonder too, if as we brainstorm, even hearing from Patrick or other education leaders too, like, what do you think what do you think the challenges of educators are going to be in the next 5 to 10 years? And what if we ask those questions of our owners, like, what do you want to see your district provide? Getting a feel from you guys too, because we want to be proactive and not reactive. So, so it sounds like to be continued on all this. Okay. Okay, so we'll keep coming back to that conversation. So next is to look at a new format for the board work plan. And I think we heard from Patrick that one way we might use these second meeting or first meetings of the month is to hear more on the quarterly presentations. So that would get built into the format. But Patrick, can you talk us through this link that you shared that hopefully everybody has access to, and your thinking behind using this to guide our work?
Sure. At the last meeting, we were talking about sort of a new format for the work plan that included these second meetings that we were talking about.
There's Rivers last, doesn't it? Oh, relax.
I thought maybe somebody had their mic open or
I thought it was
something.
just a singing, happy MAUSD play, which
That is what it is. I recognize the
Oh,
voice.
really? It is a
Yep.
play rehearsals?
No,
Oh my gosh,
I think it's a custodian in the hallway,
that's amazing.
whistling while he works, if you will.
I love that. That's awesome. Maybe he should try out for the play. They're low on male leads,
Okay.
I'm just saying.
I take it back. That was an employee.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Love it.
So,
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, so we were talking about a new format at the last board meeting, and actually Kevin raised the idea of the format that the merger study committee used, and I'm familiar with that format, so I took a stab at sort of adapting that to meet the MAUSD board needs. And so what you see linked is mostly looking back at what past meetings have been, you know, not a lot of work put into future agendas and structuring those in here, but just trying to give you sort of a sample of what it could look like to see if this would work or work better or not as a starting place for this conversation, trying to move it forward.
And I just add that at the bottom, you see work plan items to add. So can you talk maybe Sarah or Kevin or Patrick about how that's used or not used in the merger study committee? Because I don't know if that's synonymous with our parking lot or if that's, yeah, I'm just thinking about what we talked about last time, how much input board members can have in shaping future
Down at the
agendas.
very bottom.
So all the way on the bottom of page 3.
Well, we have the luxury, I'm gonna go with that, on the merger study committee of being able to move things around. And I think that we would need some kind of color-coded process in this to say, this is something that is here no matter what. And so I think that would be like our parking lot there is pretty fluid, and we have to make time for certain things because we do. We had a few deadlines, obviously, but there's not, or we created them. But I don't know that, like for us, there are certain things we have to do on certain dates, right? So I wonder if it would be helpful to have like an additional column for those items, like right in there that are like, these are our kind of like what we already have, but like they're sort of embedded into the work plan as a permanent thing. And then work plan items to add. I don't remember how we use that. Did you just go look it up? Like,
No, I didn't, but she usually puts links down there of documents and stuff. I don't know if it was necessarily,
I'm gonna go look.
yeah.
I think the intent is for that to be not so much a parking lot. I think the way I've seen parking lots historically at is a board member may have something they want to talk about and it gets put in the parking lot, as opposed to the board deciding this is an item we need to take up in a meeting.
Right.
I see the work plan items to add as a place for issues the board decides as a whole, we want to do this. And it's not, maybe someday we'll get to it. It's, this needs to be on a future agenda, and then it kind of gets worked into the work plan.
I think that would be helpful.
And to your point, Sarah, those things that are sort of the have tos, like set the tuition rate or
Right.
some of those sorts of things would be built into, I didn't build it into this, just I wanted to give a sample to see if the format was going to work. But those, as they are now in our work plan, those will be placed into the months that they would be needing to get done.
Right.
Within sort of a relatively simple kind of mock agenda, as you see here.
I'm kind of thinking that it would all end up being historical information. At
well,
the time, the
if
stuff
it's
you
a straight
filled
cut
out.
and paste from the minutes,
Yeah, but
which is what this looks like.
I'm thinking that's more detail than we need in a plan. I think the plan is very skeletal, and you know, the work plan that we've got now goes horizontally. This goes vertically, which may lend to a timeline. But I think the important thing that the important thing or the thing I liked about how Tracy used this document that I'm not sure we've been doing is that when it's done, it's done. It's still there as a history record, but there's this band where there's, within a few weeks or month or a few meetings where stuff is really starting to come together about what we got to do. And that's very dynamic. And then past that, there's like the schedule for the entirety, if you will. And it's very skeletal. But as you move down, that whole band of activity just kind of moves down through that schedule, if that makes any sense.
Well, it's kind of like
I'm gonna find it.
when I'll use construction meeting minutes as an example. We have a bunch of stuff we have to normally cover, schedule, budget, whatever. And then there's always new business. And new business, unless you resolve it there at the meeting, gets carried on to the next meeting. And if we don't, like things we've talked about tonight that need to carry over. So how do we know they're going to get built into the next meeting, or which meeting are they going to get built into? So we don't lose whatever momentum we gain from talking about it tonight. When I looked at this, I was a little bit sort of like, oh God, if I wanted to find out what was happening in June, I might have to scroll through, a lot of stuff to get to just the skeletal issue to see when we're talking about things. My suggestion at the last meeting was really not to scrap the earlier version, but to make another version of this for the other set of meetings. So there'd be another tab in the work plan for the alternate meetings. The first tab would be hardcore business. What do we got to do? What are the things that we have to monitor every year that everybody's got to have a monitoring report, reports that you have to make, decisions we have to sign off on, whatever, things that are just hardcore business go in this first work plan in a scalable format that it's in now. I think it's very readable. It's very, you can move through it very quickly and find out what things we really have to do. The other tab could be all this sort of, the other things that we haven't been able to get to. And it could be organized the same way. And it could include quarterly updates, and it could include maybe all of us working as a committee in a committee format to work on a finance issue or whatever. But all you would have to do is move from one tab to the other to get from the first meeting of the month to the second meeting.
Sort of business meetings, and you have to come up with a term for what the other meetings
It was
would
a
be,
facilities meeting for a long time, but
Right,
now
yeah.
it's just an extra work session, but it's free from the hardcore business we have to do.
Mhm.
I think we've been trying to make it be just that, but business does come up.
Yeah,
and it has
well,
to get
of course,
attended to.
yeah, right. But it could also have a like a component where, and both of them can have a component
Ongoing.
where, hey, we didn't resolve this last time, so it needs to get updated in the work plan for the next session.
That was part of your interest, Kevin, last time, was it was more of a living document.
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying, Steve, but I don't personally like the thought of having to flip through tabs to,
It's only two.
that's two, that's one too many.
Well,
I mean,
scrolling down through this document.
you could, yeah, I think.
It'd
and
be
I
by
made
the
it-
year though, just one
I
year.
made the comment that the history in this thing is too detailed, I think. But anyway,
When you say this thing, you mean the one that
The
Patrick?
draft. yeah.
the draft. I mean, you could do almost the same thing, Steve, with one document, just color code the business meetings and other meetings or something like that. And then everything's together, as opposed to like having to.
Well, I mean, maybe it takes a flush out of transferring the business to this other document. first, because obviously this hasn't been, this is just a quick example. You cut and pasted a couple of minutes into the thing, and maybe I need to see what that looks like, where you take pretty much everything that's on this Excel spreadsheet and moved it into the Word table format and see if it's any more or less decipherable.
You could also do it like reverse chronological, so the newest is always at the top.
Yeah, that was one suggestion I was going to. I guess I'm wondering what problems we're trying to solve. Like, so it sounds like there's a concern about having our public facing work plan live, editable, right? We want, is that, because you were saying you like the idea of it being a living document. Oh, is there a concern about that?
I think the only thing that was really involved in that was whether people could put stuff on the parking lot, not as a board action, but just a, hey, can we think about talking about this? I think that was one of the suggestions from the last meeting was, is there a place where we can just, hey, I was thinking about this last night and where can I put it so I don't lose it? And we might talk about it at some point.
We don't have editing rights of the one we get. So
Sure, right.
And a lot of that's driven by the risk of having the document that could be sort of collectively manipulated that then becomes board action, that then becomes a violation.
Yeah, so one thing I remember we talked about at the last meeting was revisiting the work plan or the next agenda at the end of the meeting. So that makes it less important who can edit and who can't, right? Like if we say we want this and then Dawn or I or somebody says, I'm going to make sure it gets in the parking lot. We've had the conversation of what to add, right? So that eliminates the need to have that be a joint.
Yeah. And it might be that the thing that you do to get something put on the parking lot is send down an email.
Yeah, right.
And she just puts it on the parking lot.
That's right. So I think it is valuable for us to know what's on there. To see if it needs to get plugged in. And it's also valuable for us to know what's unchangeable and then what's kind of how much space is left for other things. But are people, like if we go back to our original format, I mean, do people prefer that visually more than the list version? I mean, can we stick with what we have been using and just put that second meeting?
We could also do that. We could just make more columns and.
Yeah, so this right here only has what we're calling the business meetings on it, right?
Correct. Right. So we didn't add that in yet because we wanted. Sorry, what's there?
The other ones need to be in it. I find, and it is sort of, it's the same thing. You're either scrolling down or you're scrolling to the right. So right. I'm not totally. I mean, this is organized in a specific way. The original plan, I don't know that it is always super effective, except for like if I need to know when is that monitoring report due, I might go look there. And then a couple of other things that I now anticipate.
I mean, one thing is we don't really look at it as a group ever, except the once a year. So it's sort of up to you to look. So maybe that's part of the problem is, and maybe building in this time to just look at it together.
Well,
solve some of the concerns about what's where and what's coming up and what's on the parking lot. And yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I think what predicated this was the fact that we had this other meeting. We were trying to organize what we were going to do.
Yeah, right.
What's on here right now, we've been through many times. It's it's work we have to do, but there's not really a real pressing need to go jump into it and look at it.
Right.
And it's basically for Dawn just to make sure that when she goes to set up her agenda, she's covering the items that she's supposed to. And so it's sort of serving that purpose. It's really, what do we want to use for a tool to organize the second meeting? And there are a lot of different topics that we could address, and how do we see them, and how do we know they're being covered, or when do we know they're coming up? That's kind of what is pushing this. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a real need to modify what we have right now. So, and I agree. Maybe it's no like different to put another column of meetings in between each meeting here, and or it might be more condensed. the reason why I like the other tab idea is because it's a whole different agenda.
Right.
You know, it's a whole different list of tasks and topics that we're trying to deal with outside of the business meeting, and they're not,
Yeah.
we don't really need to see the business items mixed into the middle of that.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge could be, and you mentioned this before, Krista, that sometimes business needs seep into that second meeting. And so as I'm thinking about what you're describing, Steve, adding that additional column for these other meetings into the original work plan template makes sense, keeps it on one place, as Kevin was saying, which I think has some advantages. One of the other things that the current work plan does is it differentiates between sort of business work that the board needs to do and governance work that the board needs to do, trying to help sort of really articulate that. Maybe these additional meetings fit into one of those two categories, or maybe there's a different category that is sort of
category.
right.
Well, and if there's carryover, it's easy to move over.
And if we leave all three categories in each of the columns, then if we don't get a business item taken care of at the business meeting and we need that to flow into the next one, it goes in the business section of the next meeting, and it still kind of categorizes the types of work that the board is engaged in. So I can play around with that to give the board something to look at for next time, if that's helpful. Right.
And I think maybe it's helpful for Don and I and you to think about how to build in the process so that maybe, you know, that time at the end of the meeting, we all pull it up and we say, okay, here's that second column. Here's what's, you know, percolating or whatever, like whatever the process is that's going to help us get clarity on how we're best using that other meeting.
Yeah.
Because we don't know yet. We're still trying to figure that out.
And part of that process may need to be looking not necessarily at the next meeting, but the one following, because a 2-week turnaround to make any significant change and have a lot of prep done is pretty tight. So
we might be behind a little bit.
Right. We may need to look
as we figure it out.
Either two business meetings or the next informational or whatever we want to call those meetings.
So we need to approve this at the next meeting though, is that right? Or do we have to have an action item at the end of the next?
There is a policy that speaks to the board adopting a work plan by the end of September.
Okay.
And so that would be the next meeting. You might give yourself some latitude as we're exploring a different format to extend that into October.
Well, let's hope we can agree on it and try the process on it.
And what we can do is
at the next meeting.
We can work the current work plan until we have something to take its place.
Yeah.
You know, and the whole thing about approving the work plan, you know, as we've done in the past, it's the work plan that's in front of us now. You know, there's nothing really missing from our required business in that work plan right now. We could approve it.
It's going to check the boxes. Yeah.
We could approve it at the next meeting and still modify it.
Yeah.
The other sort of process piece, I'm thinking about what I've heard Val say in the past as we built this sort of initial work plan, and Val's saying, and it's sort of comes from a governance perspective place, our governance policy governance place. Plan the work the plan, because there will always be lots of distractions that you could never build a work plan and have plenty to talk about and work on as a board, but you might be missing some things that are important. So that notion of plan the work the plan, I think, is part of what drives the importance of having this as well.
Yeah.
The only other thing I like about the scrolling down, just to bring it up, is it would make me look ahead, which is future planning, and kind of put your head that way. And I think that being able to see also where you've been while you're like doing that process can be helpful. And I've always wondered, like, oh, while I understand sort of where I can go find all of our items, it would be really interesting to have a running document that also linked all of had links to monitoring reports, to the minutes for that meeting, all within one running document. So we kind of have like, here's this year, like in a nutshell. I don't know if that's a totally different type of,
I mean,
that's not necessarily a work plan. It's just an organizational strategy that might be helpful.
I think instead of the cut and paste of most of the minutes that you saw, if there was just
not so much minutes, but agenda.
Yeah.
Well, even a link to a link to the minutes would be a link to the agenda. And so you link to the agenda, that links you to the monitoring reports. So,
right.
it could be very short in terms of back history. It could be
Right.
simply a link to the minutes.
Right.
And I guess I included the agendas as they were written for the past meetings as sort of an example going forward. And so the idea would be that there would be somewhat of a skeleton of agendas mapped out over the course of the year that would get filled in a bit more as they got closer and we knew more about agenda items that were going to go on there. That was sort of the living document piece that I was thinking about, that we would continue to build those out further.
Yeah, I think whatever detail you need to fill in the blanks going forward makes a lot of sense. I'm not a big fan of scrolling through, 5 or 6 meetings to get to the current meeting. So the reverse thing makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think you could shorten up the history with some linkage rather than
Right.
lots of text.
I think one thing as a new member too, I'm constantly being like, wait, what did we talk about? When did we talk about that? And I wouldn't be able to do that with just links, but maybe still saying like consent agenda could be one link or whatever. But if some of the topics were still listed, so I can say, oh, we're going to talk about the linkage. I want to review what we talked about. Then I can scroll through and find that spot.
I think to Patrick's point, the point Patrick's trying to make is as we move through this, that will populate itself.
Mhm.
Because once you fill in the detail for the future agendas, you're not going to erase those when you go buy them. So those agenda
Okay.
skeleton will still be there, but you could have a link for the results of the conversation.
Right. Because the idea with this, and I think this is kind of how it works with the merger study committee, you can kind of see the title for the column is agenda/tasks. What we have here is really more agenda because they happened. But as something comes up, as we talk about an item that needs to be on a future agenda, we could in that moment go to the date we want it on there and put it into this in the sort of skeletal agenda.
Yeah.
And then that's a reference point for Don, Krista, and I to go back to and say, so we've already as a board started building whatever agenda that is. It could be 3 months down the road that we have an item that we want to talk about, and it's already starting to get built there.
That would be
Which is a little harder in the other format.
Yeah.
This is like a tool.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not necessarily our official work plan, but maybe this is a really helpful organizational tool for us to kind of keep up with
Yeah.
and have. I really think you need to start at the beginning though and work to where you're going, because you can't just be on the date that you're on. You're going to have to scroll to there. Otherwise you're starting from where are you going to where are you right now. You're going one direction or the other. You just, right now you're in the middle of it. So
If we're gonna map out the whole year, right?
right, I just feel like
So top
I
down,
want to
yeah.
like scroll through a little bit just as a tool, like a tool to use. You don't have to use it, but sometimes it's really helpful to go there and find what you need.
And I guess I would advocate to not have another document on top of a work plan that is also kind of the work plan and something else. I would like to
Yeah.
try to get an all-in-one if we could, just because it's that many more documents to keep updated and keep linked and keep
Yeah.
it in front of
Yeah.
people.
Agreed.
Yeah, to that point, I was also going to say that right now it's Dawn, someday it might be someone else, but it should be something that's really easy for the chair to work from, and that can be like consistent across chairs, so that this is how we build our agendas. Like, I have like a bajillion different notebooks and silly notes. That's, someone else might do something else. It would be great if we had a way that we do this.
In particular, I think if you look at the September 13th example for tonight, like all of our agendas, unless we change the agenda format, have sort of these, like there's a consent agenda, there's executive limitations, there's board management and governance. Sometimes there's executive session, sometimes not, but those three, almost everything we do fits into one of those 3 areas. And if we can just sort of plop in topics into those areas as we think about them for future meetings, that keeps this kind of live. I think it helps inform whoever's working to build the agendas, and it takes it from what can sometimes be this kind of nebulous, somebody mentioned something somewhere at one point, and is it going to stick into an agenda or not? It actually gives it a place to go if the board decides that's something that needs to happen.
Yeah. Right.
It's, yeah, it's sort of, I guess, I'm not sure where in this format you might have a parking lot.
Oh, we have notes.
And to me, like, so the
Is that
challenge
just
with
a
parking
list-
lots is
that just a
always,
list at the very bottom.
right, the challenge with parking lots is like, at some point, either those cars need to get started and moved, or the tow truck needs to come in. And I feel like we leave them parked for a long time, and grass starts growing up around them. So somehow getting some sort of sense of action, that's why I like the work plan items to add. Like, it's noted, this is going to be added. We can even, maybe that's a place where when we don't know where it should land, somebody else decides where, but the decision's been made, this is going to be an item in the
Well, if we
future.
don't regularly review what's in the lot,
Right.
they're not going anywhere anyway. It's just a matter of, and there's, like you said, there's two levels of it. If we all discussed it and the board has given some kind of a sense as to where they want to go with it, or is it just, like I said, I woke up staring at the ceiling last night and said, oh, I gotta remember, send somebody a note, talk about this.
Right.
And where does that live so it doesn't get lost?
Right.
And so we can all talk about that at some point. Maybe it's at the end of the meeting, just a quick
Review of
what's
out there,
what's
and
out on the
then-
list, and do we want to talk any more about it at the next meeting or
Yeah.
3 months from now?
Something we tried in the current work plan was to have, I think it might have been 3 times, maybe 4 times over the course of the year, we built into the work plan review parking lot items.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
And
And I
we've
think
done
we even
that.
did a survey.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think,
Yeah.
so there's been some effort to bring up the parking lot items and decide what we're going to do with these things. I don't think we've quite gotten yet to the point where that's functioning the way I think it's envisioned. I think usually those items come up, and for the most part, my experience has been, it's like, oh yeah, we did mention that at one point. And nobody really has much more thought on it today than they did at the time when it was brought up as a parking lot item. So it just kind of hangs there again.
Well, that's where it deserves to be then. If it's
Right, yeah, exactly.
not gotten any traction, then it's
Yeah.
not worth talking about.
Yeah.
So speaking of parking items, that's next on our agenda. But before we get to it, what's next on this? So are we saying like thumbs on the newer version, and then we're going to make a few changes based on what we heard and bring it to the group for adoption next meeting?
Yeah. I don't-
Anybody online got any comments?
Or were we saying we were just going to adapt the old one?
Can always revise it.
Those are the questions I have as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to decide
One or the other.
one or the other.
Well, I was a little bit on the fence. I mean, I haven't seen kind of the flush out of the rest of it in this format.
I could certainly do that for next time, is take essentially the contents of the current work plan, flesh this out with those sort of broad categories of consent agenda, executive limitations, et cetera, sort of put that information into the format that this has and see what that looks like and see how folks.
And what if we, along with that, before we approve or not approve it, we make sure in that same agenda that we work through what it would look like to review the next agenda.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So we're
Yeah.
like fixing the
Test drive it.
document, trying a process.
Mhm.
I don't want to have the same conversation again.
Correct.
So it might be helpful to then also see the alternative that people were potentially hoping for with if that's a
The added
possibility
column,
too, with the bottom, I don't know what you want to call it, third color, third ideas
Mhm.
so that we can as a group be like, let's stick with what we have with these additions, or
Yeah.
let's try something new.
So we'll have 2 items on the ballot.
So, right.
This version
exactly.
and that version.
And we need to just, let's
Vote
not
for the
hatch
one
it
you
out,
like.
let's just
That's it.
choose.
Yes, vote for the one you
And
like.
go with it,
Okay.
and they're both, I'm sure, highly successful planning tools. And what you said, Krista,
And then
how to,
and then we'll make sure we look at it as far as what the next agenda is gonna
I think that would be great.
entail. Okay.
So in terms of making changes to the meeting format, which is adding this agenda review at the end of the meeting is a sort of a change to our normal meeting format. Another one I've been sort of, and maybe this is not needed because we would be doing that at the previous meeting. You know, on the Career Center, the very first thing that happens at the beginning of the meeting is we approve the agenda. You know, if Don makes a change to the agenda, we vote on it. Yes, no, to change the agenda or approve the agenda as it stands. And at that point, you have a dedicated spot to pull something from the consent agenda. But right now, it's just, you kind of have to do it as a stop the process of approving the consent agenda. When you could do it, you know, at the very beginning of the meeting.
So I'm thinking maybe we hold on that thought.
Yeah. I just wasn't quite sure how we go about changing our meeting format. I mean, I guess that would have to be an action item.
That is a very common, I know Virgins and the Merger Study Committee actually vote to approve their agendas like that. The town has a placeholder and it references the PSA title, blah, 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 to review the agenda. They don't approve it necessarily, but they have a line item to review the agenda. And from my point of view, it's just a simple thing of adding that before public comment. Is
Yeah, I'm just saying,
agenda.
Is it something where we have to, I don't know, we have to warn an action to change the meeting format?
I don't know about that. The only thing that I'm thinking of, and this may not be a valid concern, but what I don't know is how well that squares with policy governance, which is the idea of really like being more planful in advance so that you're not reactive, you're proactive. So if you're opening up the door to changing the agenda last minute, we could maybe imagine different scenarios that could play out that would no longer make it our meeting. It could become a different meeting. And so I think that's
so there is guidelines in public law that you can't first off, you can't substantially change an agenda. You can modify it, and sometimes modification means I mean, we added an executive session tonight, which is out there,
right,
but you can change orders. You can change discussion or add discussion or things, but if you look at state statutes, it's actually pretty limited, but there is the capability to review your agenda one last time before you go into the meeting.
Yeah, I don't think it would be, the intent wouldn't be to, oh, I don't want to talk about this tonight. I don't want to talk about this tonight.
right.
It's more, do we all agree that this is agenda is correct and it's appropriate? And is there anything on it, you know, if we're going to make a change, are we okay with the change? And primarily the issue I have is that if there's something on the consent agenda, you kind of almost have to throw the brakes in when you go to approve the consent agenda.
Yeah.
When you could sort of in advance say, you know, can we pull item B from the agenda as we're talking about whatever we're doing. So those are the only interests I have. It may not be the interest of the board.
Yep.
And I just was curious as to how
The mechanics of how that
the
works.
mechanics of how we might
Yeah.
talk about making that change. So,
Yeah, I wonder if we want to put it up for a potential discussion item.
along with, you know, reviewing the agenda at the end of the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, can we put a pin in that one and then move on?
Yes.
Because I know we have a hard stop at 8, and I want to make sure we have, we should probably stop by 7:55 to make sure we can get organized for executive session. Where did my agenda go? Okay, but our final discussion item is a parking lot item, or something we keep punting. And so we want to really try to decide what we're going to do around committees. So we're at discussion, so we're not going to take action tonight. So we've got about 20 minutes or so to start to try to get more clear about what we'd like to do. And so I think this is would be a structural change. And maybe one way to start is to just think about what the pros and cons of committee work would be. Another way would be to identify committees that keep coming up as possible options and see what folks think about our capacity or who would like to serve on those. But maybe we could start with pros and cons.
So currently, we have less board members. And so I think a con is at capacity. And I think we would need a different format to pull it off. And I think there's my pro would be that you have sort of something that you have a little bit more depth of knowledge with. You feel a little bit more connected when you do some of that. But I would want to be doing something I was interested in. And so I would really struggle with being on the wrong subcommittee. Just gonna say that.
There's a balance here because there has been a great desire to have certain committees form, which is, and the balance is, so how far in the weeds do you go? And the desire of some forming certain committees is obviously to get into the weeds. If you look at Virgin's, they have a negotiation committee, a policy committee, a superintendent, evaluation, finance, facilities, community engagement. And some of those, if you look at a finance committee or a facilities committee, not that I wouldn't love to be on a facilities committee, because I just have that weakness, but they're
illness, weakness, strength.
It starts getting into some of the areas that we've left where we want the administration to take care of. And I'm just, if we do this, I'm just concerned that we don't end up with a bunch of committees that go after, get too far into the details.
ACSD also has the same subcommittees. Communications and engagement is one, facilities, finance, negotiations, and policy and governance.
And are they're a policy and governance board?
No, they're not. Otter Valley is, right? Is that Slate now? No, it's not Slate Valley.
Otter Valley is Rutland Northeast.
Rutland Northeast.
So I see subcommittees doing work the board needs to do, not work that is kind of duplicative of the administration.
Right.
Facilities is a good point, just in that at some level, we're supposed to approve the facilities budget. And it's one place I think we're a little bit weak on understanding what's going on at facilities in different schools. And those are the physical assets that our owners interact with all the time. So when things happen at those buildings and we don't know what those are, in more than just a 50,000 foot view of them, sometimes that's makes people scratch their heads. The finance, that's one of the things where we're supposed to be in the weeds a little bit by law. We're supposed to be looking at payroll. We're supposed to sign off on payroll. We're supposed to sign off on lots of stuff, and we're supposed to look at the financial report every month. And a lot of that people don't have the bandwidth for, and it could be that a couple of people could dedicate some time to that and report out so that the rest of us feel more comfortable about what we're signing off on every month that we don't have the bandwidth for. I think subcommittees are a struggle. None of us want to be in another meeting. And that's why I really like the second meeting idea, was that it might be an opportunity to have the whole board concentrate on a topic that would be in a subcommittee format. How do we form a policy? When Don asked Sandy and I to look into how starting up a policy governance subcommittee, like what would that take and what would our charge be? I couldn't find in our policies how we make a policy. So even something that simple. What is our process for just reviewing, other than the monitoring report? What's our process for reviewing, like what's the latest the VSBA is saying about policies? What are other schools doing about this particular policy, and what's best practice for policies? And do we need any work on the ends policy in terms of helping the CEC do linkage or whatever, blah, blah, blah. The list probably goes on. But we could put that on a second meeting agenda for everybody to look at in depth and try to keep the other meeting agenda from bleeding into it too much. And maybe that could be the subcommittee. And, you know, once we get past November, you know, and we figure out what direction we're all headed in here, it might make more sense at that point, whether maybe a full board here or a full board somewhere else, to talk about having dedicated subcommittees. But for right now, I think the best way to get it done might be just to populate the work plan with some subcommittee work.
I think that helps address some of the capacity concerns, because that's certainly, I think it's legitimate to have concerns around board capacity. I also have concerns about central office capacity, right? So I'm thinking about, we've already talked about potentially facilities and finance. If those are two subcommittees that presumably there's going to be some need from central office on, that's Floyd and or I, and that's on top of the 2 board meetings a month and negotiations and et cetera, et cetera. Pretty soon you get to 6 or 8 meetings a month in the evenings. From a sustainability perspective, it gets pretty tricky.
Yeah. I see, Brad, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think we should have, you know, too many committees, because we don't have the bandwidth for that. Although I do think that a governance committee is important, because that, you know, provides the framework for everything we do. And so I would really advocate for a governance committee. With respect to the other committees, you know, I'm not sure about a facilities committee. I agree with Patrick that there's some overlap there, you know, with a finance committee. But I do think that a finance committee would be important, because I don't know about the rest of you, but when I get those, you know, payment reports that I have to sign off on, I'm just totally clueless. I sign them dutifully, but I don't have any insight into, you know, what they really mean. And I think that, you know, given our current structure and the current way we go about looking at finances, you know, we as a board are really, you know, it's kind of a strong word, but kind of inept at being able to make any sort of helpful suggestions or feedback, you know, to the administration, because I mean the numbers are just daunting. So I mean I do think that a finance committee would be really good, and then the third one that I would suggest, which we're kind of already doing, is the communications with the community. But in general, I think we should limit the number of committees, at least for now, to see how it works. And I think that also the sort of the issue of the merger does complicate things, because it'd be a little bit pointless, perhaps, to set up a bunch of committees right now, when in the case that we end up merging with with Virgins and having a whole different dynamic to deal with. I don't think that we as a board are capable of sort of sequestering or identifying particular issues such as, you know, sort of financial or facilities issues and addressing them, you know, at just one meeting as a way to kind of focus on them. I think that, you know, a committee structure would allow for sustained, you know, sort of consideration and analysis of, you know, of the issues at hand, and then bring that back to the, you know, to the broader board at hopefully would be maybe monthly meetings as opposed to bi-monthly meetings. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at this point.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts? Sarah?
It's interesting in this process. I've gone and looked at all of these other districts' work plans and their committee structures, and a lot of them do put in one of their meetings a month. That is, like, they put in the 1 hour or whatever for that subcommittee. And maybe we don't have as many, but it is something I think for us to consider for 2023, not for 2022, but just a process, or maybe for even the following year, should we be in that position to actually have a plan going forward with that. But the report, like in CVSD, I'm seeing they have a presentation or learning, like, and then they have the reports from all their committees and other things like student council, etc. It was just interesting to go look at how they organize it and how committees kind of report out.
Can you send that link around to everybody?
Of all the things I've been finding.
No, this the one you just said. Where
CVSD.
they have CVSD.
That was CVSD's work plan. That one's old. I don't know why that one's old.
Were you saying it was, so they have their business meeting and then they have that other meeting where it's presentation, committee work?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the Otter Valley work plan is organized vertically and horizontally. Just to throw, this goes back, I know I'm off topic, but it does have also their like their pieces that they put within it. So I don't know. It's just, I'm not against a subcommittee. I think that it sort of needs to stay in our parking lot. For timing purposes. I agree though, the finance stuff is, I think it would be helpful if there were a couple people that really were pretty fluent in it. And I think that we've trusted that there are a couple people that have kind of owned that and done a good job with really paying attention. And I think if that was my job, I would own it and really pay attention. So having sort of everybody have to take something on is, I think, a total pro to it.
Yeah.
Well, the ironic thing about the finance complaint, if you want, or the finance debacle, is you're signing off on history. You're not signing off on even in process stuff.
That's true.
Those have already been.
I used to dwell on it, and then I figured that out.
It already happened. Yeah.
So we have just under 10 minutes before we should move into it, get ready to move into executive session. But I'm wondering, because there are a couple of pieces that I think I heard about using that second meeting, where it could either be committee work or just deeper board work around a particular topic. Yes. And then we talked about something else along those same lines, which was ownership linkage. And we haven't yet built out, and we also talked about communication and support to the board, quarterly updates. What if we took a stab, maybe Don Patrick and I could take a stab at looking at those second meetings, or I guess really the first meeting of the month, and plugging in some of these topics and not calling it committee work right now. But I think from the things we've heard, we have more than enough topics to dive into. And then we're not committing to a structure that could be moot in a year, but at least it gives us a chance to look more closely at some of these things. And then we could take a look at it next week or
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Okay. Anybody else on the Zoom zone wanna chime in, or is everybody okay with that plan? Cool. All right, so
Break for you.
Or do you want to do public comment?
so yeah, I
And-
suppose,
And
wait, should we do our public comment before we go in, and then
Sure.
we'll adjourn when we come out? Okay. All right, so we're in need of an executive session, which is going to start at 8. So we will have our public comment now, and then when we come out of executive session, we'll just be adjourning. So if there's anybody who would like to say anything, I don't know if we have anybody here.
No.
All right. So should we do our meeting evaluation now? Okay. I'm looking at you, Chris, because that was always your job, but it doesn't have to be if you don't want it to be.
Just waiting for it to come up. Anybody else having better luck? Oh, there we go. Maybe, no, maybe.
Maybe while Chris is pulling that up, just curious to hear thoughts, like in terms of a space, this space library feel like it's working better than the cafeteria. Certainly acoustically, I think there are advantages. I had some technical issues tonight that I'll try to get ironed out for next time, but.
It's like
Okay.
way more productive. I don't know what it is,
Yeah,
but it
it's
just feels like a
cozy.
space that is like, I actually might want to get some work done in, because I know that's sort of its purpose.
Hmm.
Use a little more air movement.
Air movement would be
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
Yeah.
that we could,
I
I
could
don't
bring
know
in
if
our
Does
big
the system
fan.
just shut down at this time, so it's not pushing in the air, or?
I don't think the system shut down at this time.
Always.
Oh,
um,
just because it's.
you're
dead
not
center
climate
building.
control.
This is an area we've been looking at for, in terms of an HVAC upgrade, to include this space, at least dehumidification, if not some air conditioning in this space, given it's certainly going forward with more use over the summers and things like that.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
sure the space doesn't meet current ventilation standards anyway.
This is on the list of spaces to tackle in the not too distant future. We have the issue of having to put a sprinkler system in and some of the accessibility things, like there's some things that need to happen first, so.
It's possible that this might be our last very hot evening here, so
Yeah.
you never know, it is
Right.
Vermont.
I really miss the vinyl flooring and the metal chairs myself.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
No.
okay, Chris?
All righty.
Yeah.
All right. What is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low?
I'd say the 7 that were,
Uh,
7 of us were pretty
It's
Chatty.
hard when you're on
There
Zoom.
was-
hard on Zoom.
There was comments from Zoom too.
Yep.
Yep, we did get some Zoom.
Was the agenda followed? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any comments? Okay, does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Yes or no?
Yes.
Any comments?
I hope our chair feels better.
Yeah. You did a good job, Crystal.
Thank you.
Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process? Yes or no?
Yep.
Yep.
Any comments? Other feedback for the chair? What went well with the meeting?
Fine.
What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings? Kate?
I think we tackled that.
All right, that's done.
Okay, so are we going to, we'll close this meeting out? Oh, no, we
First have to go into it.
We have to
Right.
have-
Oh,
Yeah,
right,
we have to
okay.
have a motion, right?
we
all
have to
right.
have a vote.
And Dawn sent the
where
link.
is-
Krista. Hi. So Dawn also sent me the the work for going into executive session. And the first motion that needs to be made is that we have determined that we meet the requirements of executive session contract 1 VSA 313A1A, right? And so we just need to have a short discussion about that. And then there'll be a second motion to go into executive session. Having determined this topic could put the district at a disadvantage, inviting members of the Lincoln School Board, Patrick, Green, Floyd, and Floyd Davison. So those are two motions that we need to handle, and there'll be a short discussion about this if you look at Dawn's note.
The first motion would be that that premature public knowledge would put the board at a disadvantage. And if that is determined, then the next motion would be to go into executive session.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you.
We're allowed to make that motion. Can Liz make that motion?
Oh, Liz can.
Liz, would you like to make that motion?
I would like to make that motion, yes.
Okay, and a second?
I'll second Sarah.
Okay. All right, all those in favor of going into
Oh, should we
executive?
have discussion?
Oh, sorry, discussion.
Because I do want to discuss this. Both parties are here. So what's the disadvantage from discussing it in public? If we were discussing something where we had a party that we wanted to have our own discussion before we discussed with the other party, I can understand an executive session. I'm just asking because it's making me scratch my head.
So I think part of it is we will be talking about things that may or may not come to fruition. So if we talk about things in public, they may or may not be accepted. And then there's this whole debate publicly as to if that's the right thing, that's the wrong thing. Somebody might think they got a leg up because of it. So
Is there a legal component, Patrick? So a concern that you would need to use additional resources for legal counsel, or that this could potentially be a litigation matter, or is that the concern?
I think it's hard to know. All of those could be potential concerns. It's hard to know where a negotiations process essentially goes way down the road. So you won't necessarily know until you've reached a conclusion whether or not you did or didn't put yourself at a disadvantage, but there's reason to believe you could. I think is sort of what's behind this. I mean, it's negotiations. It's sort of the same concept that applies to why negotiations happen with the teachers union.
That's true.
In executive session.
Both having them, both parties are at those meetings as well.
And if you remember, we kind of went around and around on that a number of years back, two or three rounds of negotiations ago, and whether or not they should happen in open session or closed session. And after that long go around, it was landed on it really should be in executive session. And those happen for us without legal present. So
right. Yes,
that's not something that tips those scales any differently. So
okay, I'm comfortable. It popped in my head and I wanted to talk about it.
I guess I do have a thinking about that though. And I don't know if this is the right place to talk about it, but we're not having either parties having legal counsel here tonight. So we would have to have a further discussion at some point with counsel.
Yeah, I don't think the intent tonight was to resolve anything. It was more to sort of cut out the middle people, have a direct conversation, understand more about what the perspectives are, and then have that as something that can inform next steps, which might involve legal.
I'm good.
I'm good.
So again, the first motion is to agree that premature public knowledge would put the board at a disadvantage.
Agreed.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so the first motion passes. So the second motion that we need somebody to make is, having determined that this topic could put the district at a disadvantage, we need a motion to go into executive session and invite members of the Lincoln School District, Patrick and Floyd, to join us.
So
Okay, Steve, and a second,
I'll second, Chris.
Chris. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so that motion has passed. So we're going into executive session at 7:58, and we'll note when we come out, but otherwise we'll just be simply coming back to adjourn the meeting. So,
Can we have a bio break?
Yeah, just.
yep, so we're gonna take just a couple minutes, folks online for
And they can
bio break.
redo that.
And I think, yeah, so I
we'll-
can end this meeting
Hopefully you all have the link.
and I can pull up the executive session link.
Fantastic.
And I think we can keep it right in here.
Yep.
Because we don't have any members of the public, so.